In this episode, the Firebox is rebuilt, we do some product testing on heat-proof paint, and the belly tanks are assembled. But first, we have a parcel arrive.
Boiler, whistle and adapter, road tyres, pack of seals, gauge glass and nuts, fixed burner kit, tea bags. Where are they?
So one of the first jobs to do now will be to start preparing parts for painting. This entails rubbing down the original paintwork and taking this back to give a keyed finish. We're not taking the paintwork completely off as there's actually nothing wrong with it. Obviously the fireboxes are going to need a bit more rubbing down because on the original engines the paint had blistered at the top of the crown of the firebox. This is a point where the burner the flame is curving around the tops of the boiler and brings it in closer contact to the edge of the firebox itself. In most cases the paint will blister off, but by using heat-proof paint this will normally cure this problem. So having rubbed down the paintwork with fine wet and dry, we're now going to be cleaning off the residue, dust, and degreasing generally the fireboxes, ready to give them their first initial coat of black heat-proof paint. The particular paint we're using at the moment is a gloss because this has very good adhering properties and will work essentially as a base coat primer. The next item to be sprayed will be the engine mounts, which we've masked off the bearings so that these don't end up filling with paint. To test the paints themselves, I'm using an old Mammoth Firebox burner. This has had numerous coats of paint on it over the years, which has now been rubbed down, and I've put gloss heat-proof paint on the firebox and a satin matte on a piece of scrap metal so I can test and see how they stand up to white spirit. After 24 hours of drying, I'm satisfied that the white spirit will not lift or damage any of the paintwork. The paint itself is still fresh, but even at this stage it's withstanding the use of a chemical cleaner. Satin black is actually a very good finish. So next off we're going to be spraying the burner firebox itself with the satin black and then heat testing it by using our Bix burner and an old Mammoth boiler, just to replicate the effects of a boiler in a Wilesco firebox. You'll notice how the paint will start to grey at the top of the firebox on the Mammoth, where the paint is closest to the point of heat. The collection of brass castings that came the other day are now being cleaned up. We've gone through them and parted off, cleaned up any mould lines. The cylinders themselves, the dummy cylinders, will sit on top of the boiler with the motion guard bolted onto the back of them. The belly tanks will have a toolbox bolted onto the top, and this has also got a tool tray which goes behind that will be a useful holder for oil bottles. So the dummy cylinder covers being cleaned up and polished. The centres are drilled through with a 10BA clearance drill, as these are held in place with a cylinder casting with a 10BA hex head bolt. With the two engines, one is going to be fired with a Bix burner and the other one is going to be fired using the original Wilesco meth tray tablets. To facilitate this, the section needs to be cut out of the back of the tender so that it's possible to get the actual burner tray in. This section is marked out on Engineer's Blue. The verniers then are set to 12mm, and that section is then marked out ready to be cut. The back of the tender is unscrewed using our 10BA wrench. To do the final cut across the horizontal, the vertical cuts are cut with the hacksaw. The fine cuts at the bottom to join them up is done with a jeweler's fret saw. This blade is probably about as thick as a hair. They are very prone to break, but fortunately we got away with it this time. This is then cleaned up, put back on the back of the tender and tested for space. The gear shift mechanism also needs modification. Because these are originally riveted on, we're not being riveting these back on in place because they have to bolt through the side of the tender to secure the tender to the firebox. So the top mount will foul the back of the main drive gear. So we are now silver soldering a 6BA bolt in place, which will then have the head filed flat, retaining a 6mm stud in effect on the back of the gear shift mechanism. Once this has been gone through the citric acid dip to remove any residue, the threads are then recut and cleaned up using our 6BA tap and using our 6BA die. The brass castings for the winch fair lead having been cleaned up, there was a bit of an error when I drilled them through, in that the holes at the top I should have drilled and tapped to hold the rollers in place. So to resolve the issue, a couple of short pieces of brass rod are now silver soldered in place and the holes are re-drilled and re-tapped for 10BA. Having re-tapped the holes, as you can see, the long 10BA bolts will now screw nicely into there and the tails can now be cut off flush. One of the fireboxes requires a Bix burner, so we have made a Bix burner mount a number of years ago, which needs a 6BA bolt drilled and tapped into the bottom to clamp the burner mount to it. We can then bolt this Bix burner mount to the front of the firebox, thus retaining the burner in the correct position. It's important to make sure that when this is screwed onto the Bix burner, that the air holes at the side of the burner are left clear, as this will impede the mix of air and gas. The actual final adjustment screw is inserted at the bottom because it will be a lot easier to get to for final adjustments. The one item on the firebox I hadn't removed before, which I've now drilled out and taken off, is the lower steering mount. This requires the footstep bracket section cut off, trimmed up and cleaned up, ready to go back on in a new position, because the existing location is incorrect for our firebox now that we're using a belly tank. So to set this up, the spare boiler was inserted into the firebox. The steering guard was fitted in place. And the steering chain mount was located at the bottom. A line is now scribed across the bottom of the firebox, marked out and drilled so that the steering chain mount can be fitted in place first. As you'll see later, there's actually a cutout on the belly tank brackets that locates into the firebox, so that will then sit just on the top of the steering chain mount. The actual locations of all this is fairly critical because you need to keep a section clear so that when the boiler is inserted it will still rotate through 90 degrees because of the way it goes into the firebox. Effectively, when the boiler is fitted in the firebox, it's fitted upside down, turned through 90 degrees and then retained with a screw in the top of the firebox. The lower part of the belly tank is now offered up, positioned correctly and spaced, along with marking out of the holes. Having marked out, it's a lot easier to position everything in the drill press and carefully drill through the existing bracket, securing it in place with a 6BA screw on one end whilst the second hole is drilled, thus keeping it all true. As you can see, that is the location tab, and that piece at the top where the belly tank is, the cutout at the bottom, is where it's critical that the boiler can clear through there. The 6BA bolts that we're using have now been silver soldered into the top of the belly tank bracket, because once the belly tank is assembled you will not be able to access the bolts again. A couple of 6BA nuts are just spun up on the threads to check that they're clean, and the bottom is then offered up onto the plate to check that it goes through in the correct position. To fix the belly tank to the underside, which contains the bracket, there are 4 lugs cast into the body of the bottom plate. By marking these out with a vernier, we can then drill through, mark out the holes on the sides of the tank and drill through both pieces to drill and tap for 10BA. It is critical that these stay in the same position and do not move. The belly tank is clamped in the drill press and carefully drilled through the centre box hole, drilling through both the side of the belly tank and into the mounting plate internally. This is then tapped with 10BA. That 10BA bolt is now inserted to hold both sections together tight. The whole process is repeated on all four sides of the belly tank and on the second tank to retain them as one item. Having now got the location for the lower steering mount, we're now setting up and using the modified steering mount on the side of the firebox with the top guide in its original position, centering through with the steering shaft to the centre of the gear wheel and drilling and fixing the steering mount, the lower steering mount in place. It was fortunate that one of the holes lined up exactly with one of the existing ones on the Rolesco side, just requiring one brand new hole to be drilled in the side of the firebox. So that concludes this episode, so don't forget to subscribe and follow this project.